So what we're going to start with here is we're going to kind of take a look at some of the different leaders here in the South and kind of their different ideas. Because what we've been talking about in class, white Southerners who are kind of perpetuating this solid South mentality are really working against African Americans in a lot of ways. And so we're going to look at some of the different ideas that different leaders and different African Americans had about what to do about the growing racism in the society and really the disenfranchisement in the South, and the segregation in the South, and all the discrimination that they're facing. So different leaders have different ideas about this. And to me, I really kind of look at this as the first civil rights movement. It's not successful. It takes another 40 years for it to be successful in the 1950s and 1960s. But this is your first group of black activists, primarily from the South, who are trying to fix these problems in society, these race relation problems that are really going on in America at the time. So the first individual that we're going to talk about, his name is Benjamin Papp, his nickname Singleton, and he has a really interesting idea. He's a part of a group called the Exodusters, and what Singleton wants to do here is he wants to kind of take all black people out of the South and bring them to the West. So this is actually something that we talked about in class during Reconstruction, and nobody really had the idea during Reconstruction to remove black people from the South, but he has this idea afterwards, and he wants to take everybody to Kansas. And he basically says, for the price of $5, we'll all go to Kansas and we'll set up land there, we'll buy homesteads, and we'll get away from the oppression of the South. So some people kind of go along with this, and they become known as the Exodusters, and they travel out west to Kansas. Now, the problem is that when they get out to Kansas, not a ton of black people are going to go out to Kansas, and when they go out there, they're going to face just as heavy racism in Kansas as they did in the South. So there's not going to be segregation along those lines, but there is going to kind of be a legacy of conflict and racism. If you remember, this is the site of Bleeding Kansas and the fight over slavery, that mini civil war in the mid 1850s, 1854. And so it's not exactly a calm place with lack of racism. And so it's not really a successful movement. Now, other people, like this guy, Henry McNeill Turner, he has a different idea. So he again also agrees that the South is not going to work. The South is not a place for black people to live because it's just too discriminatory. And so he says, like earlier people, let's go back to Africa. Let's get out of the South. Let's get all black people out of the South, and let's go back to Africa. And he specifically wants to go to Liberia. So he's very similar to these early groups that we talked about, like the American Colonization Society, who wanted to take black people out of the South, who were abolitionists, gradual emancipationists, and wanted to take black people out of the South and get them back to Africa. And so we saw that that was a white group primarily, and now we have black leaders who are trying to do the same thing. And so he's not really that successful because he doesn't get a big following at the time. Black people in America, they look at themselves and they're Americans. They're born here, their roots are in America. They really have very few ties with Africa, with African culture. It's not like the language is perpetuated and a lot of the cultural traditions are perpetuated. And they're from all over Western Africa and in some cases Southern Africa also. And so a lot of black people in the South are not willing to just uproot themselves and leave and go to a foreign country like Liberia. So he only gets a couple hundred people who are on board with this and going back to Africa. Now, this individual, Marcus Garvey, he's from a later time period. He's from the 1920s, but he's going to revive this. So McNeill is kind of like a forerunner of Garvey. And Garvey is going to revive this back to Africa movement because he again agrees that American society, especially American Southern society, is just too racist. They believe in white superiority, and a black man is never going to get a fair shake in the South. And so they want to take themselves and get out of the South and go back to Africa. He is going to be extremely popular in his time period in the 1920s. So he gains a lot of popularity. They never actually make the movement to go back to Africa, but he gains widespread popularity, and he's a very important figure later in our class. So McNeill is kind of like a forerunner of this. Now, the two kind of heavyweights at this time period in the 1890s and the early 1900s are going to be Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. The two that we're going to have, you guys are going to look into in depth, and you're going to have a nice debate on tomorrow. So Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois have very different viewpoints about what's the best path for Black America, for their community, for their people in American society. So a famous quote that comes from a speech that Booker T. Washington is going to make at what becomes known as the Atlanta Compromise speech is going to be cast down your buckets. And when you guys read that, you're going to read that tonight if you have Booker T. Washington. What this is referring to is to a couple of things. It has elements of how should white people and black people get along, race relations, uh, voting rights, and it also has a lot to do with what he kind of foresees as the future for black people in America and how are they going to improve themselves in society. A lot of what these guys talk about is how can black people help each other and how can they improve their status in society. And so one of the big things he means here by cast down your buckets, and you're going to see it when you look at the speech and put it in context, what he's talking about here is really a lot of uh, what types of professions he wants black people to get involved with in the beginning. And he really says for black people to get involved in trade schools and professions where they can work themselves up, earn a good wage, get skilled professions, and then slowly kind of improve themselves in American society. So he's looking for things like carpenters and plumbers and skilled professions that black people can make a decent living at and that they can kind of work themselves up through society. And so he's going to be a major founder of this a college called the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. And the Tuskegee Institute is really a trade school. And they're trying to train black people for professions, but trade professions, not higher level intellectual, like not like your typical Ivy League college that is going to stress traditional learning. This is going to stress trade schools and professions and practical work. And he thinks this is the best approach because kind of like one step at a time. Improve yourself, step up in American society, get skilled professions, and then the next generation after that can reach for the sky, reach for the for the top positions and go to the top colleges and kind of earn degrees in different areas in American society. And so he thinks it's kind of like a progression. And so when I look at Booker T. Washington, I like to look at him as he kind of has what I would say like an immigrant's mentality. That we're going to come here, we're going to come to this country, we're starting at the bottom, we're going to work really hard, we're going to gain some skilled professions, and maybe not my generation, but the next generation is really going to be the generation that's going to succeed and kind of reach everything that they want to. So that's kind of the way that I look at Booker T. Washington and his opinion about what the black community should do. Now, W.E.B. Du Bois has a very different outlook and a very different approach to this. What Du Bois believes in is something called the talented tenth. And he believes, basically when he says the talented tenth, what he means is the top 10% of black society, of the black community. What these people have to do, they have a responsibility. They have to kind of almost bring up the other 90%, and they have to be leaders in the society. And so they should strive for kind of the exact opposite of what Booker T. Washington is saying. They should strive to go to the best colleges and become professors and become businessmen and kind of be model for the community and try and improve the community that way by them reaching and striving for their greatest talents, and they can improve all black people and the entire black community through this process by starting businesses and starting jobs and kind of creating basically a black-run society for each other. Now, what he's going to start to do is try and start these movements. So he starts two movements. One is called the Niagara Movement, and this is kind of the first movement, which is founded in basically 1905 and 1906, and it's to try and create kind of some more social justice for black people and kind of get more rights because of all of the violations that we've been talking about that are going on in the South. So that movement, and what ends up happening to the Niagara Movement, after some race riots actually in Springfield, Illinois, famous for being Abraham Lincoln's hometown, is they're going to morph into another organization known as the NAACP, which they're trying to advance black people's standing in society. So I don't want to kind of go into too much here with the NAACP or the Niagara Movement, where I really didn't go into very much with Booker T. Washington either, because really what I want you guys to do is I kind of want to leave a lot of it for you guys to kind of do your research in and kind of gain some knowledge about exactly where they stand on voting rights, on segregation, on prosperity. So that kind of like the tip of the iceberg, just to kind of mention their basic, very, very basic ideas here. And they're really their goal here is to reach some kind of level of equality, to improve black people's standing in American society and to strive for equality here. So I'm going to kind of leave you guys with that. Make sure you do your research. Make sure you look at those links. You write good, solid answers, and be prepared to debate and to debate well tomorrow in class. All right, I'll see you guys tomorrow.